Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 2, Episode 6, Anime Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is my friend Greg. I'm trying an experiment in this episode. This isn't meant to be an interview like I've done in the past. I want it to be more of a conversation. You see, I do not know very much at all about anime. Greg is from my writing group, and he is an anime fan, so hopefully he knows more about it than I do. And he graciously agreed to co-host for this episode. And if it goes well, we might do another, but that's still up in the air. It's a little bit off the wall, but this podcast is a reader's history of science fiction, so I thought it would be good to bring a fellow reader, or in this case viewer, in to talk about it. So, hello Greg.
Hello Alex, how's it going?
All right, how are you?
Hanging in there.
So, to start off, I don't know how much the audience knows. Many of them probably know what anime is, but for those who don't, what is anime?
In simplest terms, it's any sort of animated media coming out of Japan. The term does get used in Japan to refer to any animated media from anywhere, but here in the West it refers to animation from Japan.
And usually a particular style. Like, well, the big eyes are standard.
Yep.
Oddly colored hair.
Yep. Big eyes, pointy or oddly colored hair.
Mm-hmm.
Often, like, slightly more proportional characters, although that can either be discarded for comedic effect or everyone has their own style.
Proportional as in the characters look closer to human than in Western animation?
Yeah.
Yeah,
often, not always.
I can see that. It kind of depends on the style. There are realist styles and there are less realist styles where they look more exaggerated, really skinny, proportional to the heads.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there is I don't remember what the Japanese term is, but super deformed.
Yep.
Which is where it might have a really big head, really weird facial expression to express emotion. Basically the equivalent of a wild take in Western animation.
Yeah.
Except instead of eyes popping out of the head, it'll be mouth dropping open in a weird way.
Mm-hmm. And there's using that for expression, and then there's other times when that's the whole series. So.
Mm-hmm. We're talking about an entire country's worth of animation here.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a lot of variation and a lot of different styles.
One other thing about it is one of the differences that was pioneered or like really driven home during that development period in the 60s was a difference in development philosophy where they would be minimizing the number of frames they had to draw. So if you think about, especially in early anime, there would be action scenes that almost look like it's just a cardboard cutout being moved along the screen. This is specific to that sort of philosophy of trying to make a more economically trimmed development cycle. And that's led to like a wonderful wealth of art being produced, as well as a pretty abusive and toxic working environment for the people in it. So on the one hand, it's something which appeals to producers and developers and consumers and to a lot of the artists, but at the same time, it's rough. It's hard work. It's very quick turnarounds expected. There's a lot of, I say corners being cut, and that's not like people trying to necessarily do less work, just trying to do more efficient work. Although in Western shows that draw inspiration from anime, the first season of Dragon Prince, because it was a little bit more of a gamble, had like half or 2/3 of the frame per second of later seasons to save on development costs.
Yeah. Out of the anime that I have seen, I'm thinking, of course, Dragon Ball Z is notorious for fight scenes where they're just talking for the whole episode.
Talking and shouting.
And I've seen fight scenes where instead of they're running around, they just kind of slide into place in sort of a dramatic move.
Yep.
So I'm assuming that's not just stylistic to anime, but stylistic to this cost-cutting measure.
Yeah, which I think you tended to see more of in anime, at least. The thing I've seen and been told is that that's where it really took off initially.
Now, anime goes back quite a ways. Does it go back as far as Western?
It depends a little bit on what you mean by the term.
Yeah, well, the Snow White was the first animated movie, right? Full length.
That sounds, yes, first full length traditionally animated feature film.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know when the first full length feature anime of what we would think of as modern anime aired, but a lot of the groundwork for anime was being laid in 1960, largely through the work of Tezuka Osamu. So that would be a little while after Snow White. If you're not familiar with the name, probably his best known series was Astro Boy, and there were a lot of things in that sort of style that borrowed from some of the 30s and 40s Western animation, the way the eyes and faces were animated, and some similar things there, but also began to sort of split off from that.
Yeah, I'm seeing here first feature-length anime film was 1945, but it does seem to be more something that started in the 60s, which may be concurrent with Saturday morning cartoons in America.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have as much of those precursors like Snow White and the Looney Tunes movie shorts. But from the 60s onward, it's a little more parallel.
I would say that's a fair assessment.
Now, one thing that's notable about anime, which isn't true of a lot of other foreign media, is anime has been exported to America in large amounts, where other foreign media, I feel like, hasn't so much. You don't see many Russian cartoons. You get some French shows, some British shows, but not really any German or Italian or Spanish
Mm-hmm.
or Chinese or Korean. You don't see many. I'm sure there's a fair amount coming out of the global south, but you never see any of that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Like, I know of one Brazilian cartoon that got
Mm-hmm.
localized in Canada, so we actually didn't get to see it here.
You see some French shows make it over here.
What's interesting, though, is the French shows that I can think of that made it over here tend to be the ones that have heavy anime inspirations in
Right.
them.
That's another unusual feature. How did that happen?
I can't speak as well to the history of French animation. What I hear from American animators is they grew up watching anime, and when they went into animation, they wanted to bring what they learned or what they thought was cool watching it growing up into the industry, which I could easily see that being the case in France as well. I would be interested and a little scared to dig into the French anime scene and see what's going on there and what the history there is.
And of course, I assume that's the reason we get anime style shows in America. I don't know what's on today, but when I was watching a lot of cartoons, two notable ones were Teen Titans and Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yep, the Netflix adaptation of Castlevania is a Western studio, but very much borrowing a lot of anime sort of visual style and like aesthetic notes. And at least one of those animators I've seen talking on other shows about how that's just what he grew up really enjoying. And when he got into it, that was something he really wanted to bring as well.
Circling back around to the original question, how did anime get exported to America so much more than most other foreign media?
I'm not sure, because I think what we're looking at there is something going on in the early 80s, which was before I was involved with the anime scene, having been born in the late 80s. I would associate it with, at that time, a lot of the anime being imported was not for kids. It was more mature stories, more mature themes, very free to do gory or upsetting visuals. And I think that fit really well with a lot of the countercultural stuff going on in America at the time. And a lot of that, not being as exposed to other places' animated works, I haven't seen anything like that outside of anime. So I think that sort of grittiness, grunginess, countercultural stuff really grabbed a lot of attention in the 80s and pulled a lot of people in, and they in turn pulled a lot of media over here.
That's another feature of anime where they use darker themes and sometimes bloodier imagery than you could get away with, certainly in cartoons in Western media, and to some extent, I think even in Western media in general.
Mm-hmm. There's a very different approach to the use of mature themes and gore and stuff that would be difficult subject matter. And to what extent that's just different, like, mores and sensibilities.
How much does Japanese culture show through in anime? And what are some of the conventions that reflect that?
There's little cultural things that are pretty easy to pick up on. There's no direct English translation. Before eating, the Japanese say itadakimasu. So translators have to figure out what's the least awkward thing to put in before any time a character on screen is eating. There's little things that are just unconscious observances that are taken for granted that you begin to sort of pile together and say, oh, that's normal. Prior to current times, the only place I had seen people doing a lot of wearing of face masks when they were sick was in anime. Now things have happened, but there's other things that I didn't notice on my first pass, right? Because I've been watching this since I was 10, 12. I've been watching anime for a while. I was not always an astute literary consumer. It was actually Japanese short story in a comparative lit class in college where I realized that I was really approaching a lot of media uncritically because the author of that story was trying to get you to root for a person performing a ritual suicide. And that was not something I wanted to do. And I started sort of taking a step back and saying, what are some assumptions and what are some things that are different from what the author is assuming and what I'm assuming. And that begins to open up a lot more things to look at. I want to say two big things that I see different in narrative conventions. One is if a series is not intended to have an end, if it is intended to continue going, continue selling ad space and toys, it will, instead of having a developed arc structure, it will have a series of ramps where things ramp up. And I think there are Western media that do that as well, but I feel like I have seen more anime that are doing that deliberately than I have Western media.
Story arcs in Western media have grown over time, but I feel like you may be talking about like ramping up to the next big villain.
Yeah, essentially. That's a good way of thinking
I'm
it.
reminded of Stargate SG-1, and maybe even Stargate as a franchise, where first they were fighting the Goa'uld, and then they beat the Goa'uld, and then they were fighting the Replicators, and then they beat the Replicators, and then they were fighting the Ori.
Yep,
and
that's a fair comparison.
Each villain had to be bigger and badder than the last one.
I feel like I see more of that, but now that you've said that, I feel like I'm remembering a few more Western ones. And I don't have a great way of elocuting my second point, which is I think the history of theater is very different over there. Their approach to act structure and what and how an actor is supposed to convey things. And some of that comes through in anime, just in terms of even ones with closed story arcs. They don't always hit the same, like, 3-act beats. It can be a different flow and feel.
Different narrative structure makes a lot of sense. like I said, I haven't seen a lot of anime, but I feel like there are times where I've seen some, and I've seen just enough where I can say that seems like a very Japanese way of writing that story. But I can't really put my finger on why I feel that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack. One is going back to the idea of having to draw fewer frames. There are things that there is an emphasis on being efficient about, and sometimes that'll come through in storytelling, but then there's also things that there's a cultural emphasis on being very stoic about. Whereas in English, we have the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In Japanese, they have the saying, the nail that stands out gets hammered down. So there's a much bigger emphasis placed on not loudly expressing pain or displeasure, not standing out, conformity, for lack of a better single word, which is interesting to see because this is meant to be big, flashy, exciting things. So sometimes they're leaning into that, and sometimes they're also saying, hey, we can do bigger, flashier things if we start defying some of those norms. But there's a lot of those sorts of a little bit more emphasis on the culture than on the self, and a little bit less emphasis on self-expression and more on community expression, if that makes sense. Would be how I would try to characterize it, but
that tracks with what I was thinking, and I just wasn't sure if I was seeing things that weren't there. I'm thinking of a contrast between the original Star Wars trilogy, which is the big sci-fi epic of Western media and follows a lot of old school European conventions. And the ending of that trilogy is a party with no speaking lines. Whereas in anime, the ending of an epic series would be, I think, some kind of speech, voiceover scenery, which expresses some degree of this Japanese stoicism.
I think I've seen it done with the speech and without the speech about the same number of times, but it definitely is leaning more into that stoicism. Like if there's no speech, then there's just people resuming their lives rather than stopping to have a big expression of things going on. So this sort of overlaps with a discussion of how well genres line up with anime. And there's a tendency to, instead of categorizing anime by the genre of the setting, to first categorize it by its target demographic and then categorize it by the sort of story genre and then the setting genre, if that distinction makes sense.
I can see that. And of course, we do characterize things by age demographics in America. I did an episode about that where since the 80s and 90s, it has become much more stratified in that respect. But anime does seem to categorize more by story style. I'm not sure what the terminology would be, but how dark it is, how mature the themes are, that kind of thing.
And I think that sort of putting that on the front end of the categorizing gives you some of the room to say, oh, this isn't in these younger or less mature categories. This is something else. And I think the other thing is just the difference in cultural expectations, which I don't want to make a whole lot of broad sociological generalizations, but it's a very separate history for a large period of time. So there's a lot of cultural stuff that we've picked up that they didn't, and that they picked up that we didn't. So there's just a very different understanding and expectation of what you can do with what art mediums and what's appropriate or inappropriate.
So let's skip down and talk about actual sci-fi in anime. And of course, as you said, you might say narrative style is maybe more important than setting, what we would call genre in the West. And of course, we do have things like mystery and romance that are more about style.
Yeah.
But in genre fiction, setting is a big deal. And of course, sci-fi is futuristic or otherwise alternate world. Where did sci-fi start in anime, and how did it start? I suppose Astro Boy is sci-fi.
Yeah, I mean, that's talking about an android and his found family, right? So that one is a pretty clear link to sci-fi, and a lot of the groundwork that gets laid at that time, yeah, Astro Boy sort of marks, I don't want to say the start, but like the first name that I recognize.
The first name that probably most Western viewers would recognize.
Mhm.
In that case, it goes pretty far back, and that's not that unusual. I've said in past episodes, the first movie of any kind that most people have heard of, well, I mean, there was like a train pulling into a station, but the first one was Voyage dans la Lune, a science
Mhm.
fiction movie. Very loose on the science, but still science fiction.
Yeah.
The earliest talking film most people will have seen was Frankenstein, which is more horror, but is still science fiction.
And you definitely see some of the early sci-fi anime are more on the soft sci-fi side, but there are also ones that use the opportunities of that setting to dig into some science points, or they don't irresponsibly say, oh, we just put these things in outer space and assumed they would work. They do the research to say we're putting the stations in Lagrangian points, and they'll do some of the research for it. So there's a range of sci-fi represented there.
Talking about the genres, of course, style is important, but I wonder, is science fiction considered a distinct thing in Japan in the way it is here? And the reason I say that is, for example, is Pokemon considered sci-fi or fantasy or something else entirely?
I'm going to argue that in terms of genres, Pokemon does the same thing it does in terms of marketing, where it just does whatever it can in order to appeal to someone who has a thing for any genre, because there is like development of the technologies that are needed for the fiction of the world to operate. But a lot of the fiction of the world involves fairies and dragons and quasi deific beings getting into staged fights in sports organizations. So it doesn't neatly fall into anything, and I don't think anyone's trying to neatly make it fall into anything. They just want to sell more Pikachus. But there are things that do, like Gundam, like Astro Boy, more clearly fall into sci-fi, and there is a recurring. Usually, I see sci-fi in anime showing up as stories talking about what's happening in the world right now. So Gundam had a lot to say about like Cold War stuff or post World War stuff and those sorts of conflicts and things like I forget the name of it. Ghost in the Shell. Ghost in the Shell is very strong into cyberpunk themes and post-human themes when those things were sort of cutting edge discussions. So there's always that space to visit because the first sort of division is what's marketable, and right now the thing that people keep making and keep buying is different variations on the theme of person from regular world was reincarnated into fantasy world. I'm not seeing as many fresh and exciting sci-fis currently, but they're still around and the interest is definitely still there. The vast majority of scale models that get sold in Japan are Gundam models.
Makes sense. I mean, it kind of lends itself to scale models.
Oh yeah, it's a pretty nice tie-in there.
Yeah, is it Gundam that has the O'Neill cylinders?
Yes, Gundam, I think, is credited with popularizing the idea of them in Japan. Like it was not a thing widely known prior to Gundam's publication.
O'Neill cylinders are space habitats. There are different designs, but they're generally a few miles long and they rotate to produce gravity in the interior. I've talked about Rendezvous with Rama, which is an alien space probe with a similar design. The O'Neill cylinder proper does not get much play in Western media, maybe none. I don't recall ever seeing one. Space colonization enthusiasts really like them, but you don't really see them in media. But you do in Gundam.
You certainly do in Gundam. I feel like there might have been one briefly in the background of a scene in Interstellar. But,
yeah, that might have been a Taurus.
oh, okay. You definitely see them in Gundam, and don't see them in Cowboy Bebop. You see other things that are various rotating space cylinders.
In these episodes, what I usually try to do is summarize the major signposts in, the subgenre or topic that I'm talking about. To start that, how about we back up and explain what our personal experience is with anime and particularly anime science fiction. I haven't seen a lot, but I can speak to one or two things, and I'm sure you've seen quite a few more.
I think not my first anime, because those were Pokemon and Sailor Moon, but not long after that, I started watching Trigun and Cowboy Bebop, both of which are space westerns, more or less. So you get a lot of sci-fi and a lot of western in there. And then as you get further into the story, other elements from the pasts of the characters that were almost set in separate genres begin to emerge. And those are still, to this day, two of my favorites and sort of standards that I hold everything else up to.
Where did Cowboy Bebop air? I don't remember ever seeing it in its original American run.
I would imagine it aired on Toonami, but for a lot of the early anime, they never aired per se. Fans brought things over and distributed them in swap meets, in basements, garages. A lot of the early anime coming over were fan dubbed or fan subbed.
Did some of them air on Comedy Central, or did I just imagine that? Or maybe it was Spike TV. I was thinking there were a couple other basic cable channels that would run anime occasionally.
I could see it happening on Spike. Cartoon Network for sure. In the United States, Cowboy Bebop did air on Adult Swim on Cartoon Network.
I say this as preface to say that my only exposure to anime was really through Toonami on Cartoon Network. And I saw a little bit of Pokemon here, Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z there. The only anime I seriously got into was Zoids. And Zoids there were several series, but it's basically about a world where wars are fought, and in the later series, sports are played with giant robot animals. It got to be a pretty big deal. You could buy the kits in American stores, at least for New Century Zero you could. But I mainly watched Chaotic Century and Guardian Force, which was chronologically the first series. It is about a kid whose father died in the war between these two countries, and he finds a Zoid buried in some ruins, I guess, and ends up getting swept up in events of the new war that is brewing on the horizon, and eventually has to, fight the evil empire. Standard fare. If you could maybe summarize what you think the signposts of the genre are.
There is a lot of Gundam, and I haven't gotten very far into it, so I don't know where to direct you, but that is one of the classics, one of the popular ones. There are at least 3 different adaptations of Astro Boy, with varying levels of approaching the topics seriously or cartoonishly. And definitely, I would say Cowboy Bebop should be included. If we start looking at superhero things, one of the popular currently running things is My Hero Academia. High schoolers in a world where superpowers are nearly ubiquitous, and some of the implications of that. I think those are the biggest ones coming to mind, especially in terms of like sci-fi you would expect to see.
Dragon Ball Z, is that considered sci-fi or more like fantasy? I feel like there are plenty of medieval samurai type tropes in that.
Everyone's robots or aliens, and there's a lot of space travel, but they do pretty regularly summon a dragon to raise the dead.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of fantasy peanut butter in that sci-fi chocolate. But I think it's fair to overall call it superhero sci-fi.
Would you say that the animes that got exported to America, especially the ones that officially got exported to America, overlap strongly with the signposts of the genre, or is it just sort of mass market kind of thing?
These days, it's a fairly safe bet that if there's a way to access it over here, it's because a sufficient number of people in Japan loved it that someone over here thought it would be financially beneficial to bring it over here.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that we don't get some trash, but I think it's fair to say that most of the signposts have had some sort of translation or localization at this point. Oh, Akira. I forgot Akira.
Right. Is that a movie or a show or both?
That is a movie.
And we haven't talked a lot about the movies.
Correct.
Acura and Ghost in the Shell are probably the best known ones of sci-fi.
There was recently, in addition to the live action adaptation of Acura, there was also an adaptation of Alita Battle Angel, which was originally an anime. I'm just trying to think of a Ghibli film because those are nice and accessible, but he really leans into either history or fantasy and doesn't do a lot of neat and clean sci-fi.
I've read that some of their films are considered solar punk.
That would be a fair assessment. I think Nausicaa would be a good one to go to for that. Nausicaa Valley of the Wind is a fantastical setting, but a lot of the things that are going on are the result of a world ruined by technological weapons, and some of those things bubble to the surface. So there is some sci-fi stuff that happened and is going on in that one. Castle in the Sky, or Laputa, there's ancient technology and people vying to control it. Kiki's Delivery Service is about a witch who runs a delivery service, but one of her friends is like trying to build a pedal-powered flying machine. So there's a world of technology going on in the background, and in the foreground there's a witch just dealing with a coming-of-age story.
This has been a little difficult to summarize because we are talking about an entire country's worth of animation here. So it's an entire industry and not really a subgenre. And also because the lines of the genre aren't quite drawn the same way as they are in the West. So we haven't gone as deep into the actual content as usual, but I think we can at least do recommendations. So why don't you choose one movie and one TV series that you would recommend to people, and then go into a little more detail about what they're about.
I've already done some detail on Cowboy Bebop, but it would be probably the series I would recommend.
And of course, Cowboy Bebop is known for its influence on Firefly.
Cowboy Bebop did a lot to popularize the idea of space western.
Which is interesting because that's what Star Trek was originally described as. Kind of goes back to the style over setting thing, because Star Trek was a space western in that it had a Planet of the Week style, not in that it followed Western film conventions like Firefly does.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Cowboy Bebop is notable for a lot of things, one of which is the absolutely wild amount of effort they put into a bespoke jazz soundtrack and really thoughtful animation of anything that's happening, whether that's they can't afford to keep some part of the ship running, so they've turned off the gravity and people are just drifting around, or hand-to-hand combat, or a scene in a trashy bar where someone is getting drunk and ordering expensive food loudly. Everything is very thoughtfully done, and it's, if I wax poetic, it's a story about the ending of ages and the beginning of the present and the future, but it's also a story about these bounty hunters who are usually on the brink of financial ruin and how they keep almost getting to financial stability. Comedy, tragedy, dancing, laughing, the whole 9 yards. And I would probably say for a movie, Akira is like, iconic and very much recommended, and a lot of people will tell you to watch it, and it is also very visceral and upsetting at points. And right now, I personally don't feel like recommending things that do that, so I would say Castle in the Sky.
Okay. And that's also known as Laputa. Is that based on Gulliver's Travels, or did they just take the name?
They've got the name, they've got a flying civilization, and I think that's where the similarities end. There's an ancient culture with a flying city, and unbeknownst to some people, but other people are aware and are trying to find a way to control this flying city because it obviously has all sorts of cool ancient technology on it, including the robots that inspired the design for the golems in Minecraft. Cool airships, cool vibes, just a real good time.
Okay. Well, those will be the recommendations, and I may even check them out myself. All right. Well, Greg, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I think this has been a pretty good conversation.
Thanks. I hope it's been helpful to you and your listeners.
I think it's helped me, and hopefully it'll help at least some of them. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available on all the major platforms. You know the drill by now. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, where I recently posted my entry in the annual Summer of Math Exposition contest. I'm on Twitter at SciMeetsFiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. In the next episode, I think it'll be another catch-up episode, and I'll go with Marvel movies. I'm behind schedule, and that's an easy one, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening.